Hello all of you beautiful people, Jules here for Whatculture.com, and you know what? Director Jim Jarmusch once famously said, "Nothing is original, steal from anywhere that resonates with inspiration or fuels your imagination." Well, it seems that these directors, they just ended up copying themselves. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is Whatculture.com, and these are 10 film directors who use the same ending twice. Number 10, the athlete probably dies mid-performance. Darren Aronofsky. Darren Aronofsky's superb 2008 drama The Wrestler concludes with Randy the Ram Robinson ignoring the advice of doctors and loved ones by stepping back into the ring. During the match, it's clear that his heart problems are flaring up once more, and despite his opponent's attempt to end the bout early, Randy climbs the top rope to perform his finishing move, the Ram Jam. As he leaps off the turnbuckle, tears in his eyes, the film ends. The outcome left unknown. And just 2 years later, Aronofsky did the same thing for ballet as he did for wrestling, albeit with a gonzo horror twist in Black Swan. The film revolves around an obsessive ballet dancer, Nina, who at the film's end discovers that she has, in her mania, stabbed herself mid-performance. Rather than seek medical attention, though, she returns to the stage and completes her performance, after which the crew realize that she's bleeding profusely and rush her to get help. Nina, seemingly on the verge of death, is clearly more concerned with how perfect her performance was, and then the film ends. Like The Wrestler, it's a devastatingly ambiguous ending which leaves the protagonist's fate in limbo while passing ultimate commentary on professional obsession. Number 9. The protagonist succumbs to an evil ritual. Ari Aster. Ari Aster's soul-crushing horror debut Hereditary ends with the sole survivor Peter revealed to have been a helpless pawn in a cult's ritual to find a human host for the demon they worship, Paimon. In the final scene, a weakened Peter becomes the vessel for Paimon, with Aster lingering on Pete's ambiguous facial expression as it appears the cult has completed their task. Aster's follow-up Midsummer had a number of superficial similarities to Hereditary, namely that it's similarly centered around an extremely traumatic bereavement and the central character's response to it. While the movie then heads in some directions very much its own, it ultimately ends up circling back to a Hereditary-adjacent ending. In this case, it's revealed that protagonist Danny has effectively been manipulated by the neo-pagan cult over the course of the film, who took advantage of her grief to bring her into their order. And so, in the final scene, as Danny watches her boyfriend Christian burned to death in a ritual sacrifice, Aster clings to Danny's inscrutable facial expressions, which then change from horror to happiness with no further context given. In both instances, the endings are crushingly effective and invite fierce debate from audiences, despite the fact that they're basically variations on the same elemental idea: innocence corrupted and vulnerability exploited. Number 8. The hero is an unwilling accomplice to the villain, David Fincher. David Fincher's Seven wraps up with an all-time downer ending as Detective Mills receives a present from killer John Doe, which is the decapitated head of his own wife in a box. And so, despite the protests of Detective Somerset, Mills angrily executes Doe with a bullet to the head, in turn carrying out the final kill of Doe's deathly homage to the 7 deadly sins, wrath. Understandably unable to contain his rage, Mills inadvertently played directly into Doe's hand and gave him exactly what he wanted. And the repeat happens in Gone Girl, which sees the villain of the piece rope the hero into their plot by similarly exploiting their emotions. The film ends with suspected murderer Nick let off the hook after his wife Amy turns up alive, having staged her own disappearance as revenge for Nick's marital misdeeds. Cleared of murder, Nick intends to leave Amy, only for her to reveal that she's pregnant, having inseminated herself with his sperm. Nick is furious, but out of responsibility to his unborn child agrees to stay with Amy, much to his sister's frustration, not to mention our own. And so Nick plays the part of the doting, loving husband on TV as they announce the pregnancy, trapped in a web that he sees no conceivable way out of, given that the media would crucify him if he left. Number 7. The Gangsters Life Ends In Mediocrity, Martin Scorsese. It would be a bit wrong to claim that the moral of Martin Scorsese's gangster epics was that crime doesn't pay, given that he's clearly far more interested in simply observing the torrid lives of these criminals. But the director's gangster movies do nevertheless confirm again and again that the mobster's life is ultimately incompatible with sustainability and happiness, and sooner or later they're destined to be left with just the tatters of their glamorous former existence. Case in point, Scorsese's Goodfellas powerfully depicts the downfall of mob associate Henry Hill, who eventually becomes a state informant to save himself and his family, and is left just an average nobody by the film's end. Casino similarly follows the descent of Sam, a sports handicapper and mafia associate whose gambling empire ultimately implodes amidst the war between the mob and the FBI. With the mob edged out, larger corporations start redeveloping Las Vegas, and Sam finds himself working again as a handicapper, right back where I started, in his own words. And then finally, there's The Irishman, which serves as a bleak capper to this thematically linked trilogy of chronicling the life and times of truck driver turned mob hitman Frank. Surprise, surprise, Frank's early life with the mob is prosperous, though by the film's end, he spent a stint in prison and been offloaded to a nursing home where he lives out his final days in loneliness while still hounded by the FBI for information. In the case of The Irishman, this is an ingenious feat of remixing a superficially similar ending to a more haunting, existential end. Number 6. The protagonist drives away, their fate uncertain. Jordan Peele. In an ending as horrifying as it is crowd-pleasing, Jordan Peele's Oscar-winning horror film Get Out concludes with Chris being rescued from the clutches of the Armitage family, who have been kidnapping black people and using their bodies as vessels for their old white family members, and he's done so by his pal Rod. Despite the relief of Rod's arrival, the film ends on an ambiguous note as the pair drive away to an uncertain future, given the carnage that Chris is leaving behind him at the estate. Peele's follow-up, Us, is a very different breed of horror film, albeit one that still wraps up with its protagonist in a not too dissimilar set of circumstances. Us ends with the revelation that protagonist Adelaide isn't actually Adelaide at all, but in fact her doppelganger Red, who swapped with the real Adelaide when they were children. Yeah, it's a bit confusing. This seems to dawn on Adelaide/Red's son Jason, who uneasily looks at his mother as they drive away, their destinations similarly unknown moments before the credits roll. Number 5. The hero is saved from a perilous fall. Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock sure does love perilous finales to his films, but 5 years before he even made Vertigo, the filmmaker delivered an unforgettable high-wire finale in his 1953 masterpiece, Rear Window. The film's ending sees protagonist LB thrown out of the window of his apartment by murderer Lars, leaving him clinging on for dear life. Though in this instance LB falls, he's thankfully caught by some police officer underneath, and Lars is swiftly captured. In Hitchcock's more high-concept thriller North by Northwest, released just the year prior to Vertigo, the literal cliffhanger finale was recycled for protagonist Roger, who faces off against Philip and his goons on Mount Rushmore. Roger and Eve end up assailed by Philip's henchmen as they descend the mountain. The henchman Leonard even steps on Roger's hand as he clings to the edge of the cliff. But just as it seems to be over for the pair, Leonard is shot and killed by a park ranger, allowing them to clamber to safety. But you know what? That hilariously unsubtle Freudian final shot of the train going through the tunnel was at least a true original. Number 4. Identity evaporates into a fever dream. David Lynch. It's fair to say that most of David Lynch's films feature a parade of twisted characters spread across a surreal, often dreamlike tableau, though his 1997 film Lost Highway took this to an especially challenging end with his famously opaque, some might say incoherent narrative. The film is concerned primarily with the notion of identity, as musician Fred is imprisoned for murder and inexplicably transforms into a mechanic called Pete midway through the movie. At the end, however, Pete turns back into Fred, leaves the intercom message Dick Laurent is dead, heard from the start of the movie, and then finally leads the police on a merry highway chase. Though Lynch has never confirmed the explicit meaning of this ending, one of the more popular readings is that the latter half of the film is Fred's fantasy as he sits on death row, and the feverish, white-hued final images are in fact Fred being executed via electrocution in jail. But you know what? It's not the only film to use this kind of ending, as Lynch's masterpiece Mulholland Drive similarly sees its protagonist disappear down a rabbit hole of soupy identity by the film's end. Much like Lost Highway, one of the prevailing theories is that the film is separated into two halves, one of reality and the other of fantasy, albeit in this case the two halves are actually flipped. The earlier portion of the film centered around Betty and Rita, and that's believed to be the dream of the failed actress Diane, who is Mulholland Drive's real protagonist. In the film's final sequence, she's faced with the cold reality that she had actress Camilla killed and promptly shoots herself dead. Though Lynch goes about telling these stories in different ways, both endings see the protagonists forced to confront their dueling realities in deeply terrifying ways. Number 3, the protagonist gets a creepy invitation to a basement. David Fincher. While David Fincher's repeated 2 separate endings twice, he gets his own repeat entry on this list. Fincher's Zodiac is a sustained exercise in unease, and never more so than during its anxiety-soaked climax, where protagonist Robert investigates an individual called Bob, who may be an associate of the Zodiac killer, if not the killer himself. Graysmith awkwardly accepts an invitation to speak with Vaughn at his home, where the mood becomes increasingly ominous, especially when Vaughn leads Graysmith down into a dingy basement to sort through some possible evidence. Graysmith quickly becomes convinced that somebody else is down there and bolts, but of course he has to wait for Vaughn to return upstairs to unlock the door for him. Fincher offers up a similar riff on this idea in his 2011 remake of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, where Michael is caught sneaking around the grounds of murder suspect Martin's home and is as such unable to refuse his invitation to come inside for a drink. Unlike Zodiac though, the outcome is far more perilous. Given that his suspicions are actually correct, he ends up led down into the basement, knocked unconscious, and very nearly killed, saved only by Lisbeth. In both cases, the protagonist's obsessiveness got them caught up in tricky situations which left them terrified in somebody else's basement. The only major difference being that one suspected party was innocent, while the other was definitely guilty. Number 2, rewriting history. Quentin Tarantino. It's always clear that a Quentin Tarantino-directed period piece is going to be like none other that we've seen before, but did anyone quite expect the filmmaker to go as far as he did? His sprawling World War II epic concludes with literally rewriting history, Tarantino deciding to give audiences the outcome that we all wished had happened, and that being that Hitler caught a round of machine gun ammo to the face, before the theater that they're locked inside gets burned to the ground. Tarantino's deviation from reality was unsurprisingly met with pushback, but expecting historical authenticity or realism from the guy who made Kill Bill was always going to be mighty foolish, and he pulled a similar trick at the end of his most recent film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, opting to alter the fate of actress Sharon Tate, who in real life was of course slain by the Manson family in her own home. In the film, however, the Manson family members never get to confront Tate, as they first end up crossing paths with their neighbors Cliff and Rick, who violently murder the invaders in self-defense. Tate survives, and to sweeten the fairy tale-like ending, she even invites Rick over for a drink, seeming to imply his own fading career was rejuvenated as a result. Much like Bastards, the message was clear. Cinema can serve as a corrective to the evils of reality, rewriting history in the way that we'd actually prefer to see them. And number 1, the protagonist accepts a futile situation. Roman Palansky. Roman Palansky has never shied away from a downbeat ending or two, though 2 of his movies share an especially grim sentiment. The protagonist that we've been rooting for is effectively giving up and accepting their grim circumstances. First up, Palansky's 1968 masterpiece Rosemary's Baby, which concludes with Rosemary discovering that her baby wasn't stillborn as she believed, but is being cared for by a satanic coven who arranged for her to be raped by Satan himself. Yeah, it's pretty heavy stuff. In the end, Rosemary is encouraged to bond with her son and, rather than rebel against the situation, ultimately makes the calculated decision to be a mother to that child, no matter where he came from. And the repeat happens in 1974's Chinatown, which similarly ends with the hero witnessing an array of horrifying incidents and conceding that he's powerless to do anything to change the situation. Evelyn is shot dead by the police as she attempts to flee from her rapist father Noah, resulting in Evelyn's daughter/sister Catherine being delivered into Cross's custody, presumably for further abuse. As Jake looks on in horror, he's told by an associate, "Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown." The implication being that Jake won't make any further efforts to free Catherine from Cross's clutches, well aware that there's likely nothing he can realistically do to affect her escape.